Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos, where industry leaders share their thoughts and experience on the future of space business, policy, and opportunity. If you like Constellations, please support us by giving a rating and review on iTunes. And don't forget to share this podcast online to help our community grow.
Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. Today we have Michal Anne Rogondino on the podcast. Michal Anne is the CEO and founder of Rocket Communications, but there's a whole lot more to her than that. She has a bachelor's degree in user interface design, and she started her humble career at a little place called Apple. And that's a pretty good background just there for starters. Michal Anne, how are you today?
Hey, John. I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
Well, we're going to jump right into the obvious question. So what the heck is user experience to begin with?
Oh, that's a good question, because even in our industry, people have different definitions for it. And I guess the best way to start is to give you the definition that our company has embraced. And we go back to the core. Our definition is actually one that was coined by Don Norman in the 1990s. And Don is considered the father of UX design. And he described user experience as the full experience a person is having with a digital product. And when he says full experience, it literally is that. So what is the person thinking, feeling, able to accomplish when they're using a product? And based on that, user experience design is the act of creating a user experience. And an analogy that we like to use, and it's my favorite, is architecture. And, an architect designs a building, but they don't build it. A contractor builds it. In this case, a UX designer creates that user experience, that digital product design, and an engineer will build it. So it's a really collaborative and agile process with engineers and designers to create a user experience. So based on that, then, the way that we actually create user experiences, I think this is also a really important thing for your audience to hear, because I think a lot of people have been hearing about design thinking. And design thinking is really a process of problem solving. It's how to take into consideration a user and their needs and go through a process that actually then brings you down a path to solve whatever those problems are. And design thinking is the core of user experience design. And it's something that is learnable, and it's something that I think is important to be embraced by any company that's designing software. So in a nutshell, user experience is literally what a person is experiencing using a digital product. User experience design is creating that user experience. And then the design thinking is that process that is used by the user experience designers to create that user experience.
And so you can put it all together into a user experience design, into a system, is that right?
Yeah, into a system. And the user experience is really just a term to define what a person is actually doing with the digital product.
My listeners to Constellations, are obviously involved in satellite and space world. And so let's take a look at this concept of a user experience design system. How would that apply to space systems?
Well, I think it's important to explain what a user experience design system is first, because that's really the core of what we're talking about here. A user experience design system is a tool and processes that allow a large group of people to design user experiences at scale. And what I mean by that is a commercial enterprise company like SAP or IBM, they've got an enormous number of applications that they're responsible for creating. And they need to do this in a really quick way, a consistent way, and a very professional process that they need to put into place. And that's what a design system provides, is the way to essentially create a single source of information for a large audience to be able to use in order to design consistently.
From my perspective, I think of a deep, focused insight into something. Now, if you look at architecture, we previously mentioned that. If you look at something like the Parthenon in Greece, well, you see that and it hits you over the head. Yeah, this looks great. Now, I could probably show you 12 other examples of architecture. You can know within a half a second that there's something wrong there. So this experience is arts and sciences, isn't it? It's really understanding human beings, but also understanding some of the technical aspects. So this is a kind of a balance you're working here.
It really is a balance. And a designer for software needs to understand how that software is being built. It's not just a matter of, what does it look like, what are the colors and the icons. It's how they're going to be being developed, but also really how they're going to be used. So the technology is one thing, but there's a psychology to understanding people and how they absorb information and what the context is that they're using this information in, too.
One example I like to use is that, let's say I'm up on the Appalachian Trail listening to a podcast. What can happen to me is that if I get a phone call, that podcast will go on hold. I can take the phone call, hang up, and it'll renew right where it was before. I mean, someone really thought of user experience for that simple product, didn't they? I mean, it looked real simple, but very complex to accomplish.
Yeah, it really is. And the example you just gave is one where a lot of people wouldn't even think about
exactly. That's it.
Without having gone through it. Yeah.
Right. Someone like you sits down and really looks at human beings and figure out what people do, how people use a product, and then apply it without me even thinking. I've never even thought about that interruption like that.
No, but you thought about it when it didn't work.
Yeah, it didn't, but it's so smooth. It's just like, wow, this is who thought this up? Well, that took 3 years to figure out, I'm sure.
Or it didn't.
Designing
the software, right? They might have thought it through in the beginning.
So tell me about Rocket Communications. How are you involved in redefining user experience in design for space systems?
That's a really good question. And I think we're not necessarily redefining user experience for space systems. What we're doing is just exposing user experience design to those people who are building space systems. And from the commercial world, this is just norm, right? Mm-hmm. What we're doing are basic best practices and ways of actually solving software problems for users in standard ways. And what we're doing is bringing that to the space domain.
So what's unique? I mean, what's special about user experience for space systems? Very similar to other systems or unique?
Well, there's both, really. Most software applications have the same components to them. They're built in very similar ways. You'll have a text box or icons in general, a dialog box. Those are things that almost every application has. But what's unique about space is that there are things that are very unique to that domain. And an example of that would be a timeline or the types of icons that are being used. You don't end up in a word processing app needing to actually see a satellite as one of your icons, but it's going to have meaning to people who are using space applications. So the other thing I think that's interesting about designing for space, or at least DoD space, is that there is a lot more importance on making sure that you communicate in very clear and effective ways. In a word processor, for example, something that a commercial enterprise company would build, it's important that you help people with their work and that they understand that if they select an A icon, that it's going to give them something related to text. But when we're designing for space, first off, things are usually happening in a way that's really important. So making mistakes is going to be resulting in really bad problems if you don't do it correctly. But with supporting that, you want to use colors that give enough contrast so that somebody doesn't make mistakes, so that things are very crisp and clear. And we follow military standards in the designs that we create. Same thing with icons. There can't be any ambiguity around an icon and what its meaning is. Status indicators, so that somebody understands whether something's actually an alarm or just offline. So those are the kinds of considerations that need to go into space apps that are different from commercial apps. But overall, it's really about how people are using technology, how somebody's using an application that comes into play. And that's what our company is really good at, is understanding how people use applications, what type of components are the best for different types of information and interaction, and then taking that and expanding it into what is the user doing with this specific domain. And that's really what the difference is with regular commercial apps and space applications.
I'm glad you brought up DoD because I have a question about the Air Force. I'm in Washington, D.C. They're just down the road here. I'm pretty sure that they're embarking on their enterprise ground services effort. And they're kind of re-architecting some of these little funnels or stovepipe situations. And they're trying to use a common set of enterprise services that can support all missions under a single set of standards and guidelines. And I can see that's very applicable in cloud situations. So let me focus on you. As a woman-owned small business, you have a fairly important role in the U.S. Air Force's Enterprise Ground Services effort. Tell us more of what you're doing there.
Well, we're actually doing quite a bit. We've created a space app, in particular, UX design system. This is for SMC, and it's called Astro. And to give you just a quick background, we ended up working as subcontractors with Harris in 2015, so this has been a while. And they brought us on board to actually create guidelines for some SATCOM applications that they wanted to make consistent, and they wanted to update and modernize. And in the process of doing this, we ended up getting exposure to many more applications than just the ones that we were focused on for this one project. And through this exposure, we realized that the need for consistent and modern applications was a big one at the Air Force. And in 2016, we actually went on essentially a crusade to bring the education of the importance of UX design to a much broader audience. And through that process, we were introduced to General Hyten, who also agreed with what we were trying to do. So he made an introduction to Colonel Bracey for us. And he was the one in charge at that time of the EGS program and wanted to take advantage of the investment the Air Force had already made in doing this SATCOM design system that we'd created. And now we're working on redesigning EGS applications and bringing those designs back into Astro so we can share that information at scale for people to now design space apps for the government.
Well, to quote Ron Burgundy, this is kind of a big deal. I mean, this is a big deal here, isn't it?
It really is a big deal.
Yeah, it is, though.
Well, I think that recognizing that this was necessary and then getting the support that we have from SMC has been tremendous. And what we're doing, because of the importance of this information and trying to get a large number of people designing consistently, Astro is free, it's open source, it's available online, no passwords. It's astrouxds.com, so people can go there and get this information. We've got everything up there from code to icons to components, web components that people can then download and start to build their applications with. So it is a big deal, and it's been a really exciting project to work on.
Thousands of people all over the world have listened to this podcast. If you are listening and would like to get alerts when new episodes are available, simply go to Google and type in Constellations Podcast. Click on Kratos and sign up, and you'll get interviews like this delivered right to your doorstep. There's a guy named Simon Sinek, and I think he has a book or a quote. It's always start with the why. And so my question to you is, why is transforming space systems user experience design important to the Air Force? I mean, why? Why is it important? What were they trying to meet?
Well, at its core, we're trying to create systems quickly and professionally so that our airmen are able to fight and win that war that extends into space. I know that's maybe a buzzword and a phrase that's been passed around, but we take it really seriously at Rocket. And because those airmen are getting the best technology possible, and we want them to have the easiest, best access to it. So a well-designed user experience is the best way to get them to make the most of the technology that's being developed right now. And our airmen, especially our younger airmen, they expect very high-quality user experiences with this technology, and that's not been the case. They haven't been getting what we think is that best presentation of these tools. And what the core thing is with making these applications accessible and usable is time savings in training. And when a person is actually exposed to a really well-designed application, they can learn it very quickly, and they can get to doing their job very quickly. And that's the very first thing. But the next one is when that user is getting trained across systems. In this case, what's happening is each one of those apps that are available currently actually is designed by the engineers who are building them, and they're also being designed and developed by different companies. So you end up with a stovepipe situation where that user is getting trained on one system, and that's taking a long time, and they're not able to spend as much time on their mission because that product is not well designed. Now they go to the next system, they migrate with their career path to the next system, and they're having to learn this all over again, because that application is completely different than the one before. And what we're doing is saying, okay, almost all of these applications, because apps have so much commonality, especially these space apps, make things that should be common. And that's part of the Astra UXDS system.
Yeah.
Make these things that are supposed to be common. And now that information from the first app the airmen learned is able to be transferred over to the next one. And they can focus now on learning just the mission-unique information. So there's a savings in time and a savings in cost by actually doing this for the Air Force.
So this whole concept of a single one-size-fits-all user experience, like I said earlier, easier said than done. So how does this Astro UXDS you're developing make that a reality? I mean, you go from this very difficult concept to something that is usable and doable today.
Actually, a UX design system doesn't create a one-size-fits-all user experience.
Huh.
What Astra is doing is they're providing a baseline and guidelines for those things that should be common to be able to be designed in a common way. As I said earlier, 70 to 80% of all apps are using the same common elements, but each app is unique. It needs to be designed for those users' needs. That's where the design thinking piece comes in. So you need to understand what those users' needs are, what maybe in this case the mission is, and how does the application support that. But yeah, so what's happening is that each one of those things that we would consider common and in many ways obvious is currently being designed in a different way. But with Astro, we are providing not just the specific components like buttons and icons, but we're also providing things like, let's say, a timeline. So a timeline is consisting of, obviously, a time presented in most cases a very horizontal way. And there's certain common things that are going to be in every timeline. What we've done is created a baseline for this. And now the companies who are designing their applications, they've got very specific things that they want to be able to track over that time. We're not telling them what to do with that, but what we're saying is, here is what we would consider the common way to show this. Now start from here. And that's what would create the consistency. And so we're not just saying cookie cutter, use this. We're saying start from here, try and take the basic principles from this, and if you apply those, now that understanding that transfer of knowledge is going to happen for those airmen who are learning it.
Because there's consistency, there's probably kind of a similar hierarchy. All of a sudden, it's easy to move from one area to the next, or a different type of system. So
exactly.
Yeah. So from your company, I mean, you're running the company there. What challenges do you see in just trying to come up with a design like this? Do you have technical challenges or cultural challenges?
Well, working for the government has its own unique challenges. The first one would always be contracts. So, that's just something that comes with the territory, but it is usually one of the first things that comes up is, what kind of contract are you using? The next one is actually budgets. A design system is a living system. It needs to be consistently sustained and added to, and technology doesn't wait. Technology doesn't take breaks. So with Astro, what we're doing is keeping our code up to date, constantly adding new things. We're working on creating a larger library, mapping guidelines, things that are going to give information to that wide space design or space app design audience. The other thing I'd say that is a challenge, and it's something that can definitely be overcome, is top secret clearance. And what I mean by that is, because design is user-centric, what we want to do is see how operators are actually using these systems in action. And obviously, much of this work is being done in a secret environment, so being able to watch what they're doing is a challenge. When we did our first project with the SATCOM project, the way that we did this was we had government representatives and a small set of our representatives go in and watch the operators do their job. And then we were able to create vignettes so that this information could come out with some use cases and workflows that we were able to design to. And then they were brought back into the secret environment to get worked on. But beyond that, one of the things we found is the vast majority of these applications don't need to be worked on in secret environments. What's happening is that the secret piece is really the data, not the use cases, not the actual application itself. So in that challenge, it's been convincing different companies and teams that we don't have to have a clearance to work on their applications. What we need them to do is just take out the secret data and then let us work on what those use cases and workflows are.
Yeah, strip out the important stuff. When I think of what's going on in the satellite world today, I mean, you look up at the sky, there's maybe a couple thousand satellites, a couple years, and maybe a couple, 4,000 or 5,000 satellites. No one really knows. And the only way to manage that is through, I think, automation and autonomy. And that seems to be one of the goals that the Air Force has here. So how does this concept of automation and autonomy fit in with user experience design?
Well, first off, people are not going to be replaced by computers, especially in this domain. We're always going to need somebody who's able to problem solve. If something goes wrong, they're going to need to have context in which they can actually understand what's happening and be able to make those changes or address those problems. But really, what's happening is these apps are going to have to be designed for these new ways of being used. It's not like because things are automated, we could just gray out the areas that the computer is now taking care of. So we're going to have to completely rethink how they're being designed, similar to what you talked about with the listening to your podcast and the audio picking back up again if you get a phone call. So you have to think through how is this being used and what do we do to support that. And with the automation coming into play, that's the same thing. So the rules and guidelines are still being established, but in this case, I think a lot of it's going to be what are those use cases and what are those users' needs, and then designing them specifically.
Yeah, vignettes, stories, use cases, and every time I'm thinking about this, I think there's this iterations going to constantly, and so what you have iterations and changes. You have humans interacting with autonomous systems. It gets to be very complex, and the system itself has to be easy to use in order to to interact with these autonomous systems, I would think.
Well, I mean, I think what these systems are doing is complex, and I think one of the things that is now going to be an advantage by having autonomy and letting the computers do what they're best at, we're going to be able to give our airmen or operators the tools to do other things. So I think what's going to happen is that the focus that the human is going to have is going to be different than it is now. And I think, too, that as these systems are evolving, they're going to become, I'd say, easier to use. And the types of information are going to be ones that are going to be more meaningful in some ways because you don't have people spending their time monitoring. You're going to have them spend time actually doing things.
I got a question for you about real cool stuff. The real cool stuff is virtual reality and augmented reality. Ooh, that's cool stuff to talk about. So does cool stuff have anything to do with this user experience design?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm really excited about what's coming up with the cool stuff. So virtual reality and augmented reality, I think they're going to be playing a big role in the near term with UX design. And the other thing that's interesting is, I would say, the artificial intelligence and combining that with augmented reality. So now what you've got are situations where you've got new types of information, but now you've also got a new way of presenting it. So it's sort of a double whammy. And if you're able to create context in a third dimension for a user and do it in a way that's really easy to interact with, I think that you're going to start seeing a lot of very powerful and very cool software interfaces created. I think one of the other things that people aren't taking into consideration, but it's going to be a really neat transition, is audio feedback and tactile feedback. So it's not just going to be what you're seeing and what's in front of you, and maybe even to click with a mouse or maybe with one of those gloves, those 3D gloves in your hand, but it's going to be what kind of tactile feedback and audio feedback you get and what you can do with that.
So the hot button could be a hot button.
Oh, yeah. I didn't think about that one.
I got to hit the hot button. Whoa, we know that. I'm just going to ask you one forward-looking question here, then we can end this. And so where do you see this heading in the next few years? What kind of trends do you think, and what do you think is going to really advance the state of the art for space systems?
Well, the biggest trend is that people are recognizing the importance of UX design, and that's finally being recognized as a critical part of these systems. I think the next big trend beyond that, because of this recognition, is design ops. DevOps, development ops, is something that a lot of organizations are starting to embrace. But design ops, I think, is coming next, in that it's going to have equal importance and run right in parallel with DevOps. So, people incorporating design as part of their DNA, applying user experience design processes like design thinking, that's, I think, the next big trend. It's really exciting.
Wow, design thinking. I guess experience is everything in your world, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Well, great. Well, Michal Anne, unfortunately, we are running out of time. I'd like to thank our guest, Michal Anne Rogondino, CEO and founder of Rocket Communications. Thanks, Michal Anne.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for listening to Constellation.